this evening's event is a partnership with Massey College. And I'm delighted to have that partnership. When Master Siegel, the master of Massey, and I first chatted about it, it seemed like a natural marriage. Massey is all about excellence. It's about research. It's about young people. It's about interdisciplinarity. And of course, many of the fellows in Massey come from all over the world. And that pretty well sums up what CIFAR is all about. And so this is the second of a series, we hope an annual series, of lectures at the nexus between science and research and society, and how to engage some of the top researchers, not just in Toronto or Canada or in the world, including tonight's speaker, with issues that are of importance to all of us. And that brings me to CIFAR. At CIFAR, we have believed for over 30 years now that the best way to tackle really important questions, the most exciting questions of our time and the most important questions of our time, is quite simple. And that is you put the best people in the world in a room and give them the opportunity to have a sustained and deep collaboration to address that question. And so that's what we do. We have about 400 CIFAR fellows. They come from 18 countries, 120 or so institutions. Roughly half are Canadian, and the other half are not. They divided into roughly 14 programs, and those programs range from things like quantum information science, to quantum materials, to economics, to institutions, organizations, and growth, artificial intelligence programs, early childhood development, evolution of the cosmos, etc. And I think the validity of that approach has really been borne out by the successes of our fellows and the programs that they're in over the last 34 years of CIFAR's existence. Really, a lot of the early thinking about the socioeconomic determinants of health came out of a very early CIFAR program. All of deep learning and artificial intelligence really started here in Canada at a CIFAR program. Our understanding of the evolution of our Earth, snowball Earth hypothesis, for example, came out of a CIFAR program, and I could go on and on. All our 14 children are wonderful. They're all geniuses, and they really are making really profound advances in our understanding of ourselves, our world, and our universe. It's really a pleasure to have so many people here, and I mentioned excellence, and so I like bragging about our fellows and the people associated with them. So just today, the Royal Society of Canada announced their medals for this year, and one of the medalists is Curtis Burlingame from the University of British Columbia. He's going to be receiving the Rutherford Medal. Ernest Rutherford, some of you may know, discovered electrons when he was at McGill University many years ago. Curtis is in our program called Bio-Inspired Solar Energy. And about half the winners of the Rutherford Medal over the last 20 years have been CIFAR Fellows. And then it's a real delight for me to name the winner of the Bancroft Medal. She's here in the audience with us, Barbara Sherwood-Lawler. It's something else we share with Massey College. Barbara is a professor here at U of T. The Bancroft Medal is given for outstanding research in geology and geophysics, which Barbara certainly has accomplished that. Barbara is tightly associated with Massey, and she's an incoming member of the President's Research Council here at CIFAR. So congratulations, Barbara, wherever you are. So our speaker tonight, Joe Henrich, and I'll say more about Joe in a moment, is a member of one of our 14 programs. It's called Institutions, Organizations, and Growth. And that program is trying to address a really interesting question, which is what is it, or why is it, that some countries are very successful, are powerful, some countries are united, some countries are the opposite, and we're witnessing what's going on to our friends to the south of us at the moment. We laugh at it, but it's troublesome. And there are issues there, deep issues. And why is it? Why is it that we share the same continent with the United States? We have a different history, but what is it about the United States that makes it so different from Canada in so many different ways? Why is it that some countries are rich, some countries are poor? Why is it that some countries have very strong democratic institutions and some don't? And so that program, which is made up of economists, historians, political scientists, and anthropologists, including Joe Henrich, have been meeting for a number of years now to really get at that issue. And it's a really important issue when you think about what's going on on our planet today. So let me just end by saying a few things about our speaker tonight. Joe Henrich is a distinguished anthropologist. He kind of embodies, I think, everything about that CIFAR stands for, excellence. He's at Harvard. He was on faculty at UBC for many years. So he's international now. He's interdisciplinary. His very first degree was in aeronautical engineering. And as he said to our group of great supporters just a few moments ago, he went through the alphabet and stopped at the A's. So it was aeronautical engineering and then anthropology. I hope you have another joke, Joe. Otherwise, I didn't want to steal all your jokes. Joe's research focuses on evolution. Evolution and what is it that lies behind our psychological decision-making, culture-gene interactions, how does that evolve? What does prestige mean in our society, leadership, the evolution of complex institutions in our society and how that plays out from an anthropological and biological perspective. So he, I think, brings a really important and quite unique perspective, not only to CIFAR's program in institutions, organizations, and growth, but to the world of scholarship. Joe is a professor at Harvard, as I said, in the Department of Human Evolutionary Biology, where he runs the graduate studies program. He's the winner of many awards. I'll only mention a couple. When he was in Canada, he held the Canada Research Chair in Human Evolutionary Biology. He's a Killam UBC Prize winner. He won the that's the US President's Early Career Award for Scientists and Engineers, and a few others that I could go on. Joe's research and the book that from which he'll be talking about to us this evening is really based on trying to understand why is it, and to me this is a really, such a fundamental question that we tend not to ask it. It's like fish don't ask about water, right? Why is it that when humans emerged out of Africa about 50,000 years ago, which is actually not that long ago, if you think about it, why is it that we became the dominant species on the planet? Certainly from a biological perspective, a purely biological perspective, we're not big. We don't have sharp claws. We don't have fur. We don't know how to swim or fly. We have actually none of the things you would think of a priori that you need to dominate from a biological perspective on this planet. And yes, of course, without question, we are probably too dominant a species on this planet. And so Joe's book and what he'll talk to us about this evening is The Secrets of Our Success. Joe Henrich, thank you very much.
Thanks to Massey College and CIFAR for organizing this event. I'll jump right into things here. So I want to begin by setting up a puzzle for you. And the puzzle is that how did our species go from a relatively garden variety ape 3 million years ago to being the most ecologically dominant species on the planet? And I think to get at this question, we want to go, because in the modern world, we're a species that makes aircraft carriers and iPhones and builds massive hydroelectric dams. And even in the ancient world, we built massive tombs and temples and great walls and grand canals. But we want to go back to a former time before industrial technology or the first cities or towns, and back before the origins of agriculture. Even back then, you can see that our species was fundamentally different from other species. So about 100,000 years ago, humans begin expanding out of Africa and expand into an immense diversity of environments. So sometime after 60,000 years ago, humans arrive in Australia and begin to live in the arid deserts of Australia. After about 50,000 years ago, we expand into the temperate and sometimes icy forests of Europe. After 40,000 years ago, we're into the Arctic and inhabiting the Arctic Siberia, the Siberian Arctic. Sometime around the same time, humans are in island Melanesia, living in the malarial swamps of New Guinea. And then after 20,000 years ago, we enter the New World and expand into the neotropics and all the way down to the tip of Tierra del Fuego, all before the origins of agriculture. And in this massive expansion, we're able to adapt to different environments. And when anthropologists have studied populations still living in traditional ways in the environments, they find that they're incredibly well adapted behaviorally to life in these places. Now, this is interesting because when we look at other species, they too are well adapted to their environments. So these are the kind of bird beaks that inspired Darwin when he looked at the finches in the Galapagos. But these species are adapting genetically. Now, one species that can be particularly informative is the other ecologically dominant species on Earth. So the most ecologically dominant invertebrate is the ant. But ants did it the old-fashioned way. They speciated into over 14,000 different species with a dizzying array of local, environmentally specific adaptations. Humans, meanwhile, are genetically relatively homogeneous, and especially given our immense diversity, there's hardly any genetic variation and only a few locally specific genetic adaptations. Now, I think this question is often not asked because we think we already know the answer. And the typical answer is that, well, we're smart. We have big brains. So here you can see on my slide that that's the human brain compared to the chimpanzee brain. So 3 times the size of a chimpanzee brain. And that we use these big brains to figure out, solve problems. So we solve the problems with intelligence. So the first thing I want to do is try to convince you that intelligence is not the answer, and that there's a much more powerful process at work that explains the secret of our success. And so I'm going to begin by dipping into what my colleagues and I call the Lost European Explorer files. And these are cases in which hapless European explorers, in one case it's a group of American explorers, end up in some environment that them feels hospitable and formidable and that they struggle to survive. So they typically can't find food, travel, build shelters. They often end up engaging in cannibalism. They get sick. And to the degree that they can survive, they're depending on local groups of hunter-gatherers who have been living there, surviving and often thriving for centuries or even millennia. So I want to give you the case of Burke and Wills. There's a few other cases in the book. Each one is instructive in its own way. You may not have heard of the Burke and Wills case if you're Australian. You certainly have. The year is 1860, and there's a public-private partnership in Melbourne that decides it wants to send an expedition north and south to the Gulf of Carpentaria, and Robert Burke is selected to lead the expedition. Now, this is a fascinating story, actually, and I encourage you to read more about it, but I have to make a long story short. So Burke and Wills have 12 weeks of food at one point, and they send out an advance party of 4 men with 12 weeks of food, and they head up to the Gulf of Carpentaria. After 8 weeks, they arrive at the Gulf, or they at least get close enough they can smell the salt air and the salty water, and so they declare victory and turn around. Things go poorly. They have to start eating their pack animals, and at one point, they had imported some camels from India because they thought the camels would do well in the desert. Some of their camels escape. They eventually drag into Cooper's Creek, which is only halfway. So Cooper's Creek is there. And the supply team that was going to resupply them has left. And they have to decide whether they're going to try to catch the supply team or make another choice. They end up making the other choice. They get resupplied at this point. And Burke decides instead to follow Cooper's Creek and go west to a ranch and police post that's 150 miles away. Now, the ranch and police posts are a place that's prophetically named Mount Hopeless. So they begin heading for Mount Hopeless. And relatively early on in their trip along the Cooper's Creek, their last camel gets stuck in the mud and dies. So now they're effectively marooned along Cooper's Creek because without the camel to transport water, they can't travel the last stretch after the Cooper's Creek ends to the ranch and police post. So they have to start trying to survive as hunter-gatherers along Cooper's Creek. Now they can't find food, they can't seem to hunt, they try fishing, that doesn't work. But it looks like they might be able to survive because they're getting occasional gifts of fish from the Yawantroo tribe. That's the hunter-gatherers that have inhabited the region for eons, going back 60,000 years. And while they're in one of the Yawantroo camps, they notice women processing this sporocarp. They call it a seed. And this crop's called nardu. Now, they're able to then grind up the nardoo and be able to make bread and gruel and muffins. So it looks like they're going to be able to get enough calories. The problem was when they were in the Awantru villages, they didn't notice that there's a complex processing that the women of the community put the nardoo through. So they grind it, leach it, heat it, and then only eat it with a mussel shell, or they grind it, leach it, and bake it in ash. And this is crucial because nardoo has an enzyme called thiamines, which depletes the body's vitamin B1, and you'll get a horrible disease called beriberi. So Burke and Wills are consuming lots of this nardoo, and it's giving them a full stomach, but it's toxic and indigestible unless properly processed. So they end up poisoning and starving to death while they're trying to camp out along Cooper's Creek. This is it's actually, it's of course sad, but fascinating to read because Wills was writing in his diary like a good Victorian, right down to close to the last day. And he's sort of describing the experience that he's going through. The third member of their group, whose name is King, stumbles off delirious into the outback and is rescued by the Awantru, where he stays until another party comes from Melbourne, and we have part of the story from King. Now, this example is important because Burke and Wills couldn't figure out how to survive as hunter-gatherers, and many scholars have argued that human minds actually evolved in a world of hunter-gatherers. So if there's one thing our brain should be good at, it's surviving as hunter-gatherers. We spent millions of years as hunter-gatherers. Yet when push comes to shove, we're terrible at surviving as hunter-gatherers. It's worth noting that humans have lived in Australia for 60,000 years as hunter-gatherers. Burke and Wills couldn't figure out how to do it. They couldn't find food, water, they couldn't make tools. Now, one other thing they might have eaten was the Moreton Bay chestnut. But of course, you probably don't know this, but that would have also poisoned them. So lots of the foods that hunter-gatherer populations rely on are poisonous unless properly processed. So there's a lot of know-how. Another plant they probably ran across but didn't know how to use was spinifex. So this is a kind of unobtrusive, it doesn't look like a particularly useful plant, but there are small crystals on the leaves of this plant, which when knocked off and combined with kangaroo dung, apparently other dungs aren't as effective, and then heated, it makes a powerful adhesive that you can use for making tools. Now, so the reason they couldn't survive is because they didn't get the inheritance of this kind of knowledge, this non-genetic body of information that humans require to survive as a hunter-gatherer, even in a place where we've survived for 50,000 years. Now, you might say, well, Joe, you're just putting too high a standard. There's no way any animal could survive if they're just dropped into the Australian outback. Remember I mentioned the camels. Well, those camels escaped, and if you know anything about the Australian outback, you'll know that there's thousands and thousands of feral camels now in the Australian outback. The camels survived the lost European explorer test. Camels have innate taste cues, which allow them to zero in on plants that are good for them and good for them to eat. They have powerful digestive systems that detoxify plants in a way that human digestive systems don't and are very susceptible to poisons. And of course, they have a sense of smell that allows them to find water even up to a mile away. So other animals can pass the European explorer test. Now let me come at this from another angle. This is a set of experiments, a battery of cognitive tests that Esther Herman, Mike Tomasello, and their colleagues administered to 3 different ape species. So orangutans, the Asian ape, chimpanzees, our closest relative from tropical Africa, and humans. And in fact, they specifically administered it to 2.5-year-old humans. So this is my son Josh. He's my representative 2.5-year-old human. And there was 18 different tests here, and they can be divided up into tests about space, quantities, causality, and then social learning. And here you see the results. So the vertical axis is the percentage of correct answers for each species. Now, these were incentivized tests, so all 3 species quite like snacks. And when you pass the test, you got a snack. And so it's highly motivating to all these species. Now, you'll notice that the humans performed about as well as the chimps in space. The chimps did slightly better. We couldn't distinguish that statistically if we tried, but slightly better. Same thing in causality. And in fact, in one of the causality subtests is about tool using, the chimps crushed the 2.5-year-olds. They do much better. Now, the place where you see the big division is social learning. Chimps are described by developmental psychologists as imitation machines. They're just looking out into the world and they're drinking in the behavior and the expressions and all kinds of things from those in their social milieu. Apes are better than lots of species, but they're terrible at this stuff compared to humans. And in fact, this experiment, they had to do a lot of pilot work in order to find an experiment where the other apes weren't at floor and the kids weren't at ceiling. So this is an imitation test that the other apes are particularly good at. Now, in the book, I document other comparisons between chimps and, in this case, undergrads. So chimps are able to compete with undergrads on tests of working memory. And on tests of strategic thinking, in which economists can calculate what the optimal behavior is, what the Nash equilibrium is, chimps zero right in on the Nash response. Humans systematically miss it. And in the book, I describe reasons why they might systematically miss it that has to do with their tendency to copy others, which messes them up. Now, importantly here, if we put adult humans into these tests, the adult humans would blow the roof off the test. So there would be no competition between the adult humans. So humans continue to improve their cognitive abilities from age 2.5 up to third decade of life, right? And some cognitive abilities continue to get better. But the apes are as good as they're going to get at about 5 years old. So that's when chimps stop nursing. So it's when they stop being infants. They're not getting better. So they're plateaued. So the secret of our ability to solve these cognitive tests lies in the download of information that we acquire during maturation, which these other apes don't get. I'll say more about that in a minute. So the case that I'm making is that it's not about our intelligence that explains our species' ecological dominance, but it's in fact about our cultural abilities, about the fact that we're really good at copying from others. That thing we don't let kids do when they're in school, copy off their neighbor, turns out to be the secret of our success. And essential to making that work is our sociality. So we need to be interconnected with others so information flows among minds. And that's what really generates powerful innovation and adaptive cumulative cultural evolution. This is a concept I call the collective brain. And when you begin to build mathematical models of humans using the actual learning tools that we use, you find out that a robust result from this work is that larger and more interconnected populations ought to generate fancier tools, better technology, and more adaptive repertoires. And then finally, the case I'll make towards the end of today's talk is that this has been going on for a long time, that this body of non-genetic information has been shaping human genetic evolution, and that the products of this cumulative cultural process have been some of the major forces that have shaped our anatomy, physiology, and psychology. Now, to really understand this, it's important to realize why this kind of approach hasn't been popular before. So a little bit of sociology of these approaches. So for a long time, people have been trying to apply evolutionary approaches to human behavior. The problem is this work has been bedeviled by an intellectually destructive dichotomy between nature and nurture, between explanations based on genetic evolution, which people call biology, natural selection, versus explanations based on learning or on culture, or these other kinds of mechanisms. So it ended up in this competition, and that debate didn't go very far, or I should say has been unproductive. What I'm advocating here is what we need to do is use the logic of natural selection and recognize that our capacities for culture are themselves products of natural selection. So our brains are evolved, but they're evolved not for solving finding food tasks in environments in which hunter-gatherers involved, but for acquiring information from others, because that's where all the information that you need is, and that's what Burke and Wills did insufficiently well. Then the other idea is that this then feeds back and shapes our genetic evolution. So I'll say more about that in a few minutes. Now, I want to give you a brief sense of how we do this. So how do we think about our learning capacities as products of natural selection? What you want to think about is how should our minds filter the world? So what kinds of information should we pay attention to in the world? When should we use cultural evolution versus relying on our own instincts, our own experience? And who should we pay attention to? So who in our social milieu is likely to have adaptive information that might be useful to us later on? So some cues that are generated by this theoretical approach, but we also now know are empirically found in young children, in infants even, and in adults. So young children and adults rely on cues of skill or competence. So how well someone does someone. So in a hunter-gatherer society, you tend to copy those whose arrows tend to hit their prey. Success is an aggregated technique. So in a hunter-gatherer society, you would copy the person who brings back the most prey or is the most prolific. We also know that young children also use cues of prestige, as do adults. These are second order cues. So you're using prestige when you're watching who other people are attending to and deferring to, and you preferentially learn from those individuals. It's a way of exploiting the fact that others are knowledgeable about who is worthy of paying attention to. We know that young children, even when they have knowledge about competence or success, will often still weigh the age of the other individual. So children can use age as a way of scaffolding themselves up to increasingly complex skills. So if we take my hunter-gatherer 5-year-old and he wants to become a good hunter, he could focus on the best hunter in the community who's probably between 36 and 40. Or which that hunter is probably likely to have skills and abilities that exceed the ability of the 5-year-old to learn. He's wiser to pay attention to the most skilled and successful 7-year-old. And then when he's 7, he can pay attention to the 9-year-old or the 10-year-old, so he can scaffold his skills up. The other way that age is important is that the most senior members of the community have a lifetime of experience, and they've also had a lifetime to learn from others. That's one reason why they might be useful as people to learn from. Another reason, and this one is more subtle and potentially more important, is that natural selection has been acting. Not everybody gets to be old. So by the time you're looking at the generation 60 or 70, a whole bunch of people have been plucked out. And if the practices that people use in their lifetime affect their likelihood of getting plucked out, then they're no longer in that pool, and that creates a kind of informational advantage. Finally, there's good reason to believe that humans use cues of self-similarity. So you need to acquire those skills, abilities, motivations, ways of thinking, ways of doing that are going to be useful to you in the roles you're likely to use later in life. So many anthropologists argue that the division of labor between males and females is old. It's something I'll come back to. Old in the human lineage, something I'll come back to in a few minutes. If that's true, then males should be biased to copy males and females to copy females, because that makes you more likely to get those bits of cultural information, of ways of behaving, of motivations, of skills, likely to be useful to you later in life. The same thing applies to other kinds of self-similarity. And we now know from lots of research in psychology that's been done over decades that humans are cultural learners in an immense variety of domains. So food preferences, mate choices, technological adoptions. One fun one, if you have children, is food choice. If you tell your kids what they should eat, that doesn't really work. But if you seat them at a table with slightly older kids who match them on sex, the kids will learn to eat whatever those kids eat. And there's lots of fun psychological experiments showing that. So you have to make deals with your co-parent or your other parents. Another interesting one is suicide. So when a celebrity, a prestigious person commits suicide, there's often a ripple of suicides that can spread out from that. And it often matches along these kind of cue lines. So people match on ethnicity, they match on sex as well. Lots of other domains. And these develop early. There's evidence for them in 1-year-olds. They're automatic and unconscious. We're doing it all the time without realizing it. So now we have this set of psychological capacities we can interact and learn from others, and the information is filtered by this selective attention to some individuals and some kinds of information over others. And this will produce unconsciously and outside people's awareness, cultural adaptations, behavioral repertoires that are well adapted to the environment. And I just have time to give you one example, and it's one you're familiar with, at least partially. So humans do this odd thing, which to our foods we often add spices. Now spices vary, and there's lots of different kinds of spices, but often they're chemicals that plants produce that are meant to kill fungi or bacteria or keep other animals like mammals away. And humans add these to their foods. It provides no nutritional or caloric value, but we like to add them. Now, researchers studying this have noticed that spices tend to be things that kill pathogens. They tend, in fact, the most commonly used spices are garlic and onions, and they're the most effective at killing bacteria and pathogens on meat. And if you look at across societies and you analyze cookbooks, you find that in hotter climates, societies use combinations of spices that are more antimicrobial. Now, of course, people don't eat spices, especially in hot places, because they think they're going to kill pathogens. But recipes have evolved over time so that they do kill pathogens and they make food that wouldn't otherwise be healthier. And this is an example of the unconscious learning process. I particularly like chili peppers as an example because the capsaicin in chili peppers evolved to keep mammals away. Humans are innately aversive to capsaicin. Babies don't like it. Chimps won't eat it. But humans can learn to enjoy the pain. Capsaicin actually taps a pain channel. Learn to enjoy the pain that it induces. One of our tricks is we can turn pain into pleasure. Two other things you could read about in the book. One is nixtamalization, which are the practices of using ash or burnt seashells in corn mix. And this saves people who are dependent on corn as a staple from a horrible disease called pellagra. But the people who put ash from their fire into the corn don't know that it's releasing the otherwise unavailable niacin and saving them from pellagra. It turns out to be a very hard thing to figure out. Okay, so the other idea that comes out here that I think is very important for thinking about innovation is the size of the collective brain. The more interconnected and the larger populations are, the more we expect there to be fancy tools, technology, and adaptive behavioral repertoires. And that's because we don't think so much as individuals, we think as groups. So let me just show you one piece of evidence here. This is a study done by the anthropologists Michelle Klein and Rob Boyd. And what they did is they went back to the early ethnographies for a bunch of societies in the Pacific 10, and they found good records in these societies for marine foraging technology. So they coded up the information and analyzed it to see if larger or more populous islands had fancier tools. And you can see here on these plots that this is a log scale. So larger populations had more tools for marine foraging, and those tools tended to be more complex. So this is a measure of tool complexity. So more tools and more complex tools. They also looked at contact, because although the islands provide a nice way to decide what a population is, the islands are interconnected and there are sailing between the islands in those times. But the low contact islands tend to be below the line, which means if you're low contact, it's suppressing the fanciness of your technology. And if you're high contact, you're above the line. So this shows both size and interconnectedness affected the toolkits of Polynesians or people in Oceania. Now this is important when sometimes paleoanthropologists will try to read the cognitive complexity of ancient human species by looking at how fancy their tools are. Big mistake. So you wouldn't judge Hawaiians to be genetically, cognitively more sophisticated than people from Manaus. These are part of the same Austronesian expansion. This is relatively recent human history. But because we think as collective brains, different populations who are genetically indistinguishable cognitively can produce quite different forms of technology. Now, this is just a correlational study. So we wanted to see if we could get a grip on this in the psychology lab. So this is a project I did with Michael Muthu-Krishna at the University of British Columbia. And we created a kind of micro-society. So we gave undergraduates a task to use a complex image editing program to recreate this image. That was the thing they had to recreate. They had a time limit. They got paid cash for their performance, so how similar their thing was to the image, and they got paid for the performance of their students. And then the key thing is there were two different treatments. So in this treatment, the teacher in one generation would pass down their information only to one other individual, and it was then linear for 10 generations. In the other group, this generation can learn from anybody in this generation, and they can see them all and see what they did, whereas these guys can only see one. So after you did the task, you had your time limit, you wrote up to 2 pages to pass down to your student. Remember, you would be paid if your student did well. And so the next generation would get the product, whatever the model made, which would give them a measure of how good the model did because they can compare it to the target, as well as the model's write-up, so the cultural transmission in this case. This is a quick look at the results. So this is 10 generations, and this is the skill or the ability to use this complex image editing program to match the target. So when there was only one model to look at, you can see this group initially in the first generation did well, but then it goes nowhere, and they're not able to generate greater skill. But when you can access more of the models, you're more interconnected, the cumulative process kicks in. And in the final generation, these guys are 2 to 3 times more skilled than the earlier generation. Now remember, subjects are randomly assigned to these groups. There's no intelligence difference between these groups. This is just the product of the social interaction. Okay, now I like this is that I presented this particular experiment because you can actually see the results. So these are the actual images that people made. And this is generation 1 down to generation 10. So you can see in the 5 model case, things did not go well here in round 1. I'm not sure what this is. And things did not go well in round 2. So I don't know what that is. But then this guy gets it. And then these guys get it. And then they start fixing it up and things go. So by the time you get to this last generation, the worst person in generation 10 is better than the best person when they're only receiving one-to-one transmission. So that shows the importance of interconnecting. Now, I think this reaches back deep into human evolutionary history. And one of the things the key moment, which is actually probably a really long period of time, was when humans crossed this Rubicon and our culture became cumulative. Because that's when the interaction of genes and culture really kicks in. So once you get cumulative cultural evolution, you get increasingly fancy tools, fire and cooking, tracking techniques. And then the game is for genetic evolution to build brains that are not better at doing those things, but better at acquiring those things via cultural learning, acquiring, organizing, storing, and maybe even retransmitting this valuable information. But the thing is, once brains get better genetically at doing that, then culture just revs up even more, and it generates clothing and shelter and medicinal plant knowledge and even fancier tools. Now the genetic side is like the only game in town is learning, figuring out how to be a better cultural learner, because once culture is cumulative, the stuff in the minds of the previous generation is way better than anything you could figure out on your own by individually interacting with the environment. So you've got to be an obligate cultural learner. And the better you do it, the better you're going to do, because you're going to be able to get fancy tools from one guy, medicinal plants from another guy, shelter building from the best shelter builder, and it can aggregate and recombine. Now, of course, in the human lineage, it looks like our brains hit the stops. So primates are the only mammal where the head size of the baby is larger than the hole it can fit through. So brains get shrunk down into sort of cans and slid through there. Babies are born premature compared to other primates. That's because you got to get that big-headed baby out of there. So selection has done all that it can. It actually twists the female pelvis a little bit to help that. So that's hit the stops. But of course, cultural evolution continues to spiral and accumulate more and more information. One of the first things that I think might have happened is a division of labor. So not everybody can know everything once there's so much information. So a division of information between males and females is the foundation for the division of labor. Males specialize in some really hard to learn things, females specialize in other hard to learn things. And then of course later we have external storage and books and then the internet. That's a quick summary. Okay, now this is the products of gene cultural evolution are going to shape our physiology, anatomy, and psychology. So the recurrent features of the environments that we faced over human evolutionary history are heavily influenced by these cultural products. So this is the output, the cultural adaptations, and these are going to be cultural things, and these are going to be genetic things. So the first example I want to give you is an easy one to understand, or the easiest one to understand. So if you look and you compare human anatomy and physiology to that of other primates, you find that humans have strangely small teeth, we have small stomachs, and we have short colons. This makes good sense if you realize we're a primate who eats cooked food. We invented fire, there's an argument about this, but let's say 1 million years ago. This allowed us to cook. This means our food comes in pre-digested. This releases the selection pressure on having big intestines and a large stomach and big strong jaws and muscles that reach up to the top of our head. We can get rid of all that extra baggage and just cook our food. The thing about fire and cooking, though, is it's highly cultural. If I was to take all of you up to cottage country and say, start a fire with no technology, most of you would struggle to start a fire just from some instinct, probably wouldn't fire up. So we have to really depend on cultural know-how to do that. But we've been doing that for so long that it's altered our physiology and the length of our intestines, our colons. Another fun one is my colleague Dan Lieberman has argued that we're the running species. We have all these adaptations from literally toe to head that show that we're really good at long distance running, and human hunter-gatherers can chase down antelopes because the antelope collapses from heat exhaustion before a person will. One of the things we have is we store energy in our arches. We also have a nuchal ligament behind our head that allows our trunk to twist independent of our bodies that we see in other running animals, but not in primates. Another cool feature is we have acrine sweat glands all over our body, and these pump out water that is over our body that cools us as we run, so it gives us evaporative cooling that we don't see nearly to this degree in other species. The interesting thing about that is if you look at that system as an engineer, you're like, elegant, beautiful, but there's a big flaw. There's no water tank. There's nothing to fuel the big sweating system that's supposed to do all the cooling. But if you look at how persistent hunters in small-scale hunting and gathering societies do this, they use cultural technology. They use ostrich eggs or skins, or they have knowledge about where roots are that contain water, or trees that contain water, or they know to look in other certain places to find water. So this is a gene culture coevolutionary package that explains a whole bunch of features of our anatomy, but only makes sense if you have cultural products that are hard to figure out to start with. Now, I'll just mention two others of these. So when you study little kids, you find they immediately start making a distinction between artifacts and other kinds of things, both living and also non-living, non-artifacts. This is a distinction we don't see in other primates, so it looks like we're primed to assume there are artifacts and tools in the world. You wouldn't get that unless you'd had artifacts and tools from which your cognition has to respond genetically. And then finally, my last one, and this is what the center section of the book is about, is this notion of self-domestication. So once you have cultural transmission, you can transmit not only behaviors, but the standards by which you judge others. And that means you can have social norms where if you violate the group agreement, the group rules, you get punished, you get a bad reputation, you can't find mates, you can't find marriage partners. And that then begins to shape the species. So it's self-domestication. We become more docile, more social, more rule-following in a way we don't see other species. We actually have many of the features of a domesticated animal, although most domesticatable animal brains shrink and ours expanded. So there is that one difference. Okay. So I'm going to do this slide very briefly and just say that one of the cool ways that one of the cool things about culture is it can make us smarter. A lot of the reason we're getting smarter from age 2.5 up is because we're getting more and more concepts and tools that are products of long-term cultural evolutionary processes. Things like these tools and screws and springs haven't always existed, but once you grow up in a world with them, you can solve new problems with them, and it makes us smarter. I can say more about that in question and answer if you want. So I want to close here by asking the question, why do we care? So why does it matter what human nature is, or what kind of animal are we, or what the secret of our success is? And I think this is an important question that has big implications for how we do institutional design and policy design, because it's often unrecognized, but other disciplines have at their core assumptions about human nature. And the problem is that most of the time these assumptions go uninterrogated. So economics, the discipline that I know relatively well, is based on an Enlightenment philosophy kind of filtered through 19th century philosophers. And that's the assumptions about human nature that we have. And we know that many of those assumptions are wrong and misleading. So one of the things I wanted to do with this book was try to say, let's build a new foundation for the social and behavioral sciences that's rooted in what we know about human evolutionary biology, but takes seriously the unique nature of our species. And this will allow us to do better institutional design and better policy design, rather than having disciplines based on uninterrogated assumptions about human nature. All right, that's it.
It is now my great pleasure to invite two junior fellows, colleagues from Massey College, to join us here on stage and to join in the process of asking questions to and learning from our guest speaker tonight. Rosemary Martin is the second year PhD with Shannon Macaulay in the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology, having just transferred from a master's. Rosemary's research focuses on how winter environments affect survival, phenology, population dynamics, and interspecific interactions in freshwater, aquatic, and vertebrate communities. She has mostly worked with ordinates, both lab and field settings. Rosemary, would you come up and join me on stage now? Devin Ward is a first-year PhD student with Bence Viola and Mary Silcox in evolutionary anthropology. She's currently expanding her research. She began during her MPhil at the University of Cambridge, examining the causes and consequences of morphological variation in the modern human inner ear. For a structure with a very conserved purpose, there is much unexplained variation in our species, with the potential to relate to many variables, including gestational health. Devin also has extensive field experience and has worked on active archaeological projects in Gibraltar and Italy. Please join us on stage, Devin. So the purpose of this part of the evening, not only to illustrate how profoundly bright the junior fellows at Massey College are, but more importantly, to engage in a way that produces questions that our guest can answer and hopefully generate some interest amongst all of you in asking further questions in the time that we have together. Are either one of you ready to ask a question?
We'd like to thank Dr. Henrich for such a thought-provoking talk. And eventually we will open the questions to the audience, but to facilitate the discussion section of this evening, we're going to start off with some questions that Devin and I have prepared. So without further ado, Devin will ask the first question.
So hopefully I'm not the only one wondering this, but did peeking into the lost European explorer files motivate you to take an outdoor survival course?
Well, I was a field anthropologist, and so I was early exposed to kind of life as traveling around by dugout canoe in Amazonia. So I got a sense, I've learned a bunch of stuff from the Machagenga about how to find food. And one of the things that was shocking during that experience was that I was an Eagle Scout, and so I spent a lot of time doing wilderness survival. And I was just amazing how inept I felt when I was around the Machagenga, because they just have this body of knowledge that I didn't come close to. So one of the things about being an anthropologist is you always feel when you're doing field work like you're the dumb guy in the community, because you don't know how to do anything useful.
Okay.
I felt that way in the Senate for a while.
In your book, you discuss how music, and especially ritual participation through music, acts to build cooperative behavior. But more recently, many genres of music have their own subcultures that may clash with mainstream tastes. For example, hey, Dad, classical music sucks. I'm going to go listen to hardcore rock. And so what is the effect of rebellious subcultures that may cause division rather than unity in the evolution of our human societies?
Sure. And I think the way you want to think about this, so just as background in the audience, in one of the chapters, I make the case that ritual is one of the ways in which humans build social bonds. So you see this across human societies, and for, I don't know, certainly decades, probably a century, anthropologists have been making the case that when humans, and they're thinking of small-scale societies in this case, participate in rituals, it bonds the community together. So you can find ethnographic description after ethnographic description that'll say the harmony in the community is greatly increased after they did a big ritual and they rebuilt the bonds and they danced in synchrony or they shared an experience together. And so now in psychology, in the last 10 years or so, psychologists have begun taking the elements of rituals and asking the question, does this element increase cooperation or sociality or make people feel more bonded? So one thing that psychologists have done work on is synchrony. So if you march people around in synchrony, which is interesting when you think about military drill, when you march people around in synchrony, they'll be more cooperative in a public goods game, a game where you have to give money to a group project and you have the potential of free ride and be selfish. People are less selfish in these experiments. And they also report feeling more bonded with the other individuals they're with when they've engaged in synchronous activity. And then you can pull out music, and music seems to have, at least according to some studies, an independent effect from synchrony. And then there's even rituals throughout this small-scale societies in which you experience something terrifying together. So these are classic rites of passage. And that seems to really bond the people who co-experience the terrifying events together. So one of the ways psychologists have studied this is by looking at people who had traumatic experiences and war together. This seems to create this brand of brothers effect. But in many societies, the society actually has a ritual that terrifies the young men, and so they bond together. And it's often done with people from other groups, so it creates enduring bonds with men who, you're going to get old together, and they'll be in a different band, but when you see each other, you'll have this kind of bond. So the way to think about the different groups doing different things is this is just the fuel for cultural evolution. So different groups come up with different ways of doing rituals, and nobody really knows what a good ritual is going to be like, what the keys are to our psychology that's going to cause this bonding. But by creating lots of variation, you can gradually improve and hone ways in which ritual can get inside of our heads and build bonds between people. So you mentioned these subcultures. It's worth pointing out that both Christianity and Mormonism were exotic subcultures that found a way to spread, and seem to have spread pretty widely.
I think Joseph has just explained the importance of the high table at Massey College.
Is that
Yeah.
a terrifying experience?
There are moments, trust me, there are moments.
But that's actually one element. So eating together seems to build some sort of solidarity. There's a reason why we decide to share meals all the time.
So you spoke at length tonight and in your book about the advantageous ideas that can spread due to cultural evolution and selection. But I'm also curious about the maladaptive ideas that may spread, and sometimes those may even be consciously spread. So you mentioned suicide quickly in your talk. I was wondering if you could expand a bit more on how some of these disadvantageous ideas spread.
Yeah, so that's one of the interesting parts about cultural evolution is the idea is that these mechanisms, these biases we have are on average adaptive, but you're essentially making a bet that it's going to tend to triangulate you in on the right idea. It means that a bunch of the time you're going to get either neutral things or even maladaptive things kind of free riding along. The other interesting area of research is it's under some conditions you can have adaptive learning mechanisms that can steer you off and create something very maladaptive under certain conditions. So one example is real emphasis on prestige can do this. Probably is important in our own society that prestige can be amplified by the media and then cause people to go down paths they wouldn't otherwise go down. But some of the better studied cases is a case in Micronesia. And in Micronesia, people began attending to and giving prestige to very good yam growers. And soon people began to compete to see who could grow the biggest yam. And this caused men to focus on growing the biggest yam. But soon the yams got so big that they were fibrous and inedible. And so they meant the men would spend lots of resources to grow these giant yams that nobody could eat. And so you can see that this is an adaptive thing which was improving our farming practices. The cue of having a big yam became so important that the yams grew to the point at which they weren't edible. And then you can see that waste resources. I think there's lots of examples, including that in our own society.
Let me just say we do have two microphones, one on each side, and if anybody here this evening would like to get at the microphone to pose a question, please be free to do so. Could I ask a question while our colleague is moving to the microphone? What does government do with these insights? What would a thoughtful government seeking to appreciate the nuance and the different kinds of learning that you've talked about, what areas of its policy should it affect most constructively?
So my wife does public health, so I feel like I have some insight into the field. And one of the things that's very hard to get out of people in public health's heads is that education matters. So they always have this idea that we're going to teach people to use latrines or to wash their hands. And once they get this information, they'll start doing it. And this seems to have failed time after time. And I've always urged her to write a paper on showing all the different ways in this has failed. So it happens that, this is my example of how this could inform policy, but the British government decided they wanted to try to convince women to do more screenings for these genetic variants that cause breast cancer. So they started a program in January of 2013. And the program was going along, and maybe they saw a few bumps, a little bit of increase in women going for the screenings. And then Angelina Jolie wrote an op-ed in the New York Times in which she discussed her decision to get a double mastectomy because she had this variant. And the day after that, the call lines flooded in New Zealand and Australia and the US and Canada with women who wanted to get screened for the genes. And this, we all know this then resulted eventually in lots of surgeries being scheduled. And the rate of calls remained elevated until November or December of that year. So she elevated the rate for the whole year. And Britain is fun because we can see that this campaign of information did almost nothing. And Angelina's one op-ed, a powerful, prestigious person with access to the media, basically solved the problem, got the word out, and lots of women got screened, and lots of cases of cancer were probably averted. So that's a case where we have this kind of rational notion that if people are well informed, we can get them to change behavior, but it's actually about a piece of cultural learning.
Which raises the issue of celebrity, both positive and negative, which is another kind of...
Yeah, the advertising industry has figured this one out.
Yes, ma'am.
You mentioned briefly the role of language, that is symbolic communication, as a driver of adaptability. And your thesis seems to be that we should perhaps look more at sociability as proportionately a greater driver of our great success as a species and adaptability. But I'm thinking of other species of primates, most especially bonobos, which are known to be highly social, and it has been argued that they are even more social as the third, we're the third chimp, as the second chimp than we are. There are other mammals, such as meerkats, that are intricately and very highly social. Nonetheless, the level of invention and adaptability is not comparative, and might not some evolutionists argue that our acquisition of highly evolved language, that is symbolic usage, and of course other animals, and most particularly other mammals, have symbolic communication, not just chemical communication, et cetera, but quite complex often methods of symbolic communication, like wolves, dogs, other primates. Nonetheless, we seem to have evolved symbolic communication at a comparatively fantastic level. And so in, let's say, a debate about which might be more important, sociability or language acquisition, and whether or not the language acquisition or the sociability might be, in Gould's term, a spandrel or not, is there not a very great debate there?
So let me make sure I got your question right. So you're wondering about the place of language in this story? Is that...
We're just at the weighting of the importance of language versus sociability.
Yeah.
And some of the debate around that, and I know that there's a very intense debate around, what's the driver of what? Is it a spandrel that is an accidental acquisition, or not?
Yeah, so my approach to that is to say that language, so I emphasize tools and technology in this talk. In the book, I lay that out at the beginning, but then I bring in language, and I see language as just another domain of culture. So you got tools, you got language, you got institutions. And languages actually work. I mean, we learn language using some of the same cultural learning mechanisms and cultural learning biases. Languages accumulate. Larger populations have larger vocabularies, more phonemes, fancier grammar. So it seems to fit all the same patterns of cultural evolution as the tools do. So the story is that language is nothing special. So the chapter is called Communicative Tools with Rules. So you're trying to solve the communication problem, and you're gradually ratcheting up a repertoire of these shared tools for which we can communicate with.
I'm going to let Devin and Rosemary ask another question, and then I'll come back to the second question. Devin?
Sure. Okay. So with globalization that we find today, the ease and connection and exposure to other cultures has increased, which increases the potential for horizontal transmission of these cultural practices and ideas, but also potentially decouples these cultures from the historical context in which they were developed and the genetic background in which they evolved. So do you think that this is more likely to lead to our ability to select and integrate and adapt to new cultures, or will it more likely lead to a tendency to kind of grow more conservative and stick to what we've grown up with?
Yeah, so my view is that anything that is going to interconnect more and more people is going to lead to faster rates of adaptive cultural evolution, more innovation. Even the rate at which people engage in horizontal transition seems to be much higher in modern Western societies than in small-scale societies where there's more parent-to-child transmission. So all this should fertilize the amounts of recombination. Although I think that the point you made early in the question is important, because we are losing a lot of repertoires of knowledge when we lose languages and cultures, because there are whole ways of, say, constructing a grammar or kinds of ways of carving up the world that when you lose a language and a culture, you don't get to see anymore. So those could be powerful and fertilizing. But I think the lesson of history is that languages that improve, technologies that improve travel and increase communication spur innovation. And so
Evan, did you have another question?
Oh, go ahead. I think it's a good
All
time
right,
to take on
I'm
your
just going to ask our
questions.
colleague across the way, and then I'm going to come right back to you, ma'am. Yes, sir.
Certainly. I think we're going to come around to this sooner or later, so I'm going to be the one to do it. As a case study, I'm sure everyone is dying to know what your thoughts might be on how this would apply to the current U.S. election. And I know it's a funny way, but so let me clarify that, frame that a little bit for you. I've been listening carefully to what you said, and I'm listing off some of the things that don't seem to fit. For example, we have candidate, kind of a maverick candidate that breaks all kinds of social norms, but still seems to be rewarded. Doesn't demonstrate confidence, like he's not the one with the sharp arrows that are hitting all the prey. And also, he doesn't seem to be a good match for, his own group, like the Republican Party, like in terms of policies and the things that he says. Yet, getting enormous traction. We're seeing enormous traction in the polls, in the rallies, in public profile. And of course, you've got to be wondering, what is going on there? Is it some, are there cultural cues? Or does cultural evolution inform this and help understand? Because, pundits are at a total loss.
So I have a collaborator as a psychology professor at the University of British Columbia named Jess Tracy. And so we decided to videotape the debate between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. And one of the ideas I developed in the book is that humans have two kinds of status, both of which can be important for leadership. Status based on prestige, where you're thought to have knowledge and competence, and one based on dominance. And so we're analyzing the ethologies and the speaking styles using a coding system that we developed years ago to distinguish dominance and prestige. I don't know what the answer is going to be yet, but it'll be interesting to see if they're actually using these two different avenues of status, which we found in lots of our experiments. But the one thing I was wondering, and this is purely speculation. I haven't studied this question. I think that Trump may appeal to a wide breadth of the electorate because it feels like some people they know. Like he has characteristics and mannerisms that go very much with lots of subcultures in the U.S. And of course, he is a billionaire, which he likes to point out. So it could be that he's tapping these various kinds of cues. But you're asking me to go way, way, way out of my area of expertise.
I'd love to talk more, but I'll let other people.
Thank you very much. And ma'am, you've been very patient, and please ask your second question.
And my second question is, with regards to an ongoing and very intense debate about whether selection happens at the individual level, the so-called selfish gene, versus group selection, with the group selection theory having been under intense attack, would you place your theory in the group selection, let's say, end of things? And how would you defend your theory against those who would argue that it's individual selection, the so-called selfish gene, that whole conversation?
Sure. So the case that I lay out in the book in terms of the group selection debate is a complex and nuanced one. So in the book, this is actually in the footnotes, I make the case that in humans, the effective intergroup competition, say having warfare between groups, is unlikely to have any effect on human genetic evolution, because we know this from studies of lots of societies that when one group conquers, they'll often kill all the males and take the women as wives or as concubines. And so there's a big flow of genes between the groups. This is going to erase any differences between the groups and leave only individual selection operating. Now, that doesn't work at the cultural level. So the case the book makes is that while group selection is unlikely to be an important force in genetic evolution for humans, cultural evolution doesn't have that same problem of diffusing the differences between groups. So when migrants come into a cultural group, they have to learn the local norms. And even if the adults can't learn the local norms, their kids do. Whereas if genetic migrants come into a group, they have the genes they brought from the other group, and their kids have the genes. So the nature of the inherited systems makes these quite different dynamics. So in the book, I make the case that cultural evolution has favored institutions and sets of norms and marriage systems and rituals that increasingly give people the ability to cooperate, interconnect groups, lead to larger collective brains. And so this has been a cultural evolutionary process. Now in the wake, there's still individual genetic evolution that has to adapt to this world that was built by cultural group selection.
So the last three questioners are at the mic, and I'm going to ask them to proceed and ask you to put your questions. And I'm going to ask Joe to answer all three of them, if I may. So, sir.
Hi, good evening. I'm a junior fellow from Massey as well. My name is Peter. Thank you very much for the talk. So one of the ideas I brought out was the cumulative brains, and you used the undergraduate experiment and the pattern from UBC to illustrate that, as well as the island one. Appears that there seemed to be a correlation with the number of members within this cumulative brain and the success of how they're able to propagate and create innovation. So when you look at the structure of higher income countries who seems to be more successful and better at innovation compared to lower and middle income countries, do you feel that pattern still holds? And if not, do you feel it's more instead of just numbers, is it more about the efficacy to which they can utilize a certain framework to better calculate that cumulative brain? And if so, what are some of the factors that affect the efficacy of this cumulative brain?
Joe, keep a record of that. Yes, ma'am.
We'll see how big the brain is.
We'll test the size of the human brain in the next 5 minutes.
So as our world is becoming increasingly globalized, where certain nations and indeed cities, it goes, at all different levels, are responsible for certain parts of agriculture, product manufacturing, all sorts of things, and are economically dependent on these exports. Has this affected the division of labor beyond simply gender division? And if so, what does this mean for the future of division of labor amongst all cultures? And finally, can you, because of globalization and the prevalence of it at this point, would you be able to apply theories of epidemiology to cultural transmission and social learning?
Thank you. Just keep that in mind. And the final question.
One last question. So I'm wondering, at what point of technological development do you feel that we might outstrip our capacity to adapt evolutionarily?
You can work backwards if it's easier, Joe.
Let me work forward. So, I think maybe this starts to address two of the questions, which is one of the things you got to deal with when you're thinking about innovation in increasingly complex societies is not just the size of the population, but the division of labor. Because in order to make that next advance, you have to have a certain amount of, it's really the population at the knowledge frontier that's capable of taking the next step. So, for example, if you look at US cities, the larger the city, the more innovation you get from the city. And that's part due to population size, but it's also in part due to the number of different specializations you have in the city. So you just have more different experts in the city that can interact and create novel innovations. So this is relevant to the question of developing societies because you got to get a certain population, a certain community of people to the knowledge frontier in order to allow people with different expertise to interact. So my colleague at Harvard, Ricardo Hausman, studies this, and typically cities they expand the division of labor in a very systematic way. So there's certain kinds of things you're not going to have until you have a whole bunch of other things. And you can't take the next step until you've accumulated them. So I think that answers some of the questions.
Okay. Did you want,
the third question, I don't know.
You don't know the answer. So there's no greater sign of a coherent and competent intellect than being able to admit that he doesn't know. I think you will agree with me that we've had a remarkable reflection and intellectual engagement around some of the core foundational issues of how society has come about, the choices we have made, the roots of civilization and humanity, and all the other linkages that are fundamental to getting along in this world that we share. And I would like you to join with me in expressing our appreciation to both our guest speaker and the two junior fellows who have put him through his paces here tonight. Massey College is really honored to be a partner with CIFAR in these undertakings. We think it speaks to the core premise of interdisciplinarity in both institutions and the role that both institutions play, not only in finding solutions to tough questions, but having the courage to work with people who actually have the ability to ask the right questions. And that's what we are celebrating here tonight. We're honored to do it. Thank you all very much. Thank you.